My interview today is with Dr. Aubrey Morrison. Dr. Morrison is a distinguished academic nephrologist at Washington University who is also a master of the college. Dr. Morrison, I know that you grew up in Guyana. Well, I guess it's called Guyana now. I think when I was young, it was called British Guyana to separate it from Dutch Guyana and so on, which I think is Suriname now. But
that's right.
What did your family do? What were kind of your circumstances growing up?
Yeah, my father was administrating education. So in my early part of my life, we moved around a lot, and I really became stable in my teenage years. My mother was basically a homemaker.
What caused you to go into medicine? What was the inspiration?
Well, I actually did at high school, I did relatively well in the sciences. And my first love actually was physics. And I actually seriously considered doing physics as a career. The problem was that any role models that I had growing up in Guyana who did physics, the only thing I could come up with was my teachers. On the other hand, the interaction with family friends who were physicians and recognizing that even in my family, there was a sort of reverence towards physicians, and they seemed to have a very nice stature in the community, is one of the things which sort of floated right up onto the top of the cream, so to speak, that maybe this was a choice that I should make. Now, I knew that my parents wanted me to do medicine, but they never pushed me. They let me decide what I wanted to do. And then I guess about 2 years before I graduated from high school, I decided that I was going to do medicine.
Were you the only child, or did you have siblings?
I had 4 other siblings. My oldest brother went into banking. My younger brother migrated to Canada. He tended to be a little bit more in the arts and artsy kind of individuals. And both of those are now deceased. I have 2 sisters, both younger. One lives in Toronto, and the other one lives in outside of Orlando, Florida. So
nobody's left in Guyana then? I guess no. Your parents have passed?
That's correct. My father passed in Guyana, and then I was in United States, and I had a brother and a sister who lived in Canada. So my mother migrated to Canada to live close to them.
So I don't know anything at all about higher education in Guyana. Was there a medical school there at the time?
There was not a medical school there at the time, and there was really not a university there at the time when I graduated from high school. There has subsequently been a University of Guyana and a medical school, which was started, I guess, would be in the early 70s.
I don't know a lot about higher education in the Caribbean, but I've had exposure to a number of graduates of the University of the West Indies Medical School, and they seem quite good. Did it exist when you were looking at?
Yes, it was, and we had a scholarship which was given. We all took the English external exams, and so the person who got the highest, was the most competitive, would get what we call a Guyana scholarship. And it was not infrequent that they would go to the University of the West Indies to pursue their professional career, either usually in medicine or in the arts and sciences. Those who wanted to do law eventually went usually to England.
How did you choose to go to the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland then?
That's an interesting story. So my first choice was to go to St. Andrews in Scotland, because I had a classmate whose older brothers went to St. Andrews, and that was the context. So I applied to St. Andrews, and in my final year at high school, and I didn't get in. And my sense then was, and that was the only place I applied. So I decided after that I would apply to multiple places, and the very first one that accepted me, I'm going. So the next year, I applied to multiple places in England and Ireland. I got into the Royal College, signed on the dotted line, and then about 4 weeks later, St. Andrews accepted me.
But did St. Andrews have a program that would culminate in getting an MBBS then, or not?
Yes, I mean, I would go from, the English system, you go from high school into medical school.
Right.
Yeah, and that's essentially what I would have been doing. Yes.
Where was St. Andrews located?
In Scotland. Well, I'm not sure what part of Scotland it was. Yes.
The only place I visited was Edinburgh, and I was a guest one time to give a talk at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and had a chance to look around, and it looked delightful to me. What was your time like in Dublin? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, yes, I did. This was the first time I had actually left home. This is the first time I had a chance to be independent and take care of myself, so to speak. I had to do my own laundry, had to do my own shopping, had to do the usual things that people have to do when they leave home. And this was an extraordinary experience for me. I found that to give you a little bit of background, in the Royal College of Surgeons, historically, what they did was the incoming medical students came from essentially three categories. One third were Irish, 1/3 were from so-called developed countries, and 1/3 were for underdeveloped or third world countries. And I fit into that third category. So the opportunity that I had for interacting with people from multiple parts of the world was one of the more fascinating experiences I've had. It was wonderful. I mean, and it was actually fun for me coming from what I would have considered a small country, Guyana, to try to compete with people from England, South Africa, East Africa. We even had from Australia, Norway, Sweden. It was kind of fun. Yes. Yeah.
I think when you were there, Dublin was perhaps more economically depressed than it is now. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've had the option to go back subsequently. It was like night and day. It was just strikingly different. Strikingly different.
Did you have an opportunity to enjoy some of the things that Dublin has to offer? I like theater, and I made it a point to go to the Drury while I was there and see some plays. Did you have the opportunity to do that?
Not so much. I was more fascinated by the countryside of Ireland, and so the opportunity, any opportunity I had to go to Galway and Cork and just see the countryside, it was just almost lush green, almost all over, and then this rather unique small towns that you'd go through, spend a night with a bed and breakfast. It was kind of fun doing it that way. And I had a very good friend I met. He was in my year of medical school. He was from Trinidad, and he and I would do this all over Ireland as much as we could.
Your clinical training in undergraduate in medical school, was it different from or similar to clinical training in U.S. schools at the time?
Let's see now. We spent about the first 3 years essentially doing anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. And really it was not because this was a 6-year program. So it was not until the end of that 3rd year that you got involved in clinical centric. But, we didn't have at the time as much, how should I put it, the radiology and the usual tests, the clinical tests that are available, which help with the diagnostics. So you were very much, they always stress this business of use your eyes, your ears, and your hands. And so clinical medicine was a premium in those places. And so actually it was a great experience for me, and it served me well when I came to the United States.
So did you, U.S. medical students around the same time, before funding became available for many previously indigent patients, medical students used to have to do a lot of the lab tests themselves, gram stains and urinalyses and so on and so on. Did you have to do that in Ireland?
Not so much when I was at Barnes, but certainly when I rotated to City Hospital and to the VA Hospital, we had sometimes to draw our own blood, take the blood down to the laboratory to get it tested for type and cross match. We'd have to do our own EKGs. Sometimes we'd have to wheel the patients to the radiology facility to get the x-rays if they were able to be wheeled. So yes, in some instances, you were involved in more ways than one in your patient care.
So when you were in school, what was you already alluded to this a bit, you like to travel and see the countryside. What else did you do in terms of social life as a medical student?
Well, most of the socialization was between the students. However, I grew up with a Methodist, and I must tell you the story. I grew up with a Methodist, and when I got there, as you know, in Southern Ireland, only about 10% of the religion is non-Catholic. So, but the Methodist Church, for some reason, had a very strong influence in Dublin. And I met this young man, his name was Philip Walton, who was my age, who was actually attending Trinity College. And one day he invited me home after church to have supper with his parents. And I went in and I was introduced to this gentleman, and his name was Ernest Walton. It turns out he was one of the pair who split the atom and won the Nobel Prize.
Ah.
So that was a fascinating, I had a chance to chat with him. It was actually a fascinating experience. So, you know, in some respects, I got to meet people who I would never have had a chance to meet. And so that was also very fun.
Well, what made you decide to leave the United Kingdom for your postgraduate training then?
I actually had an opportunity to get a taste of, and it's obviously this is not the real taste of American medicine, but I had a chance to do an externship in Canada just before I started my senior year. And that externship was at McMaster University, just as McMaster was getting started. They had all their full professors, like the guy who was the professor of pediatrics, come from Great Ormond Street in England. And they were just anxiously waiting for students. And we fell right into, there were two other students who actually rotated, did that externship with me from Dublin. And they were just wonderfully wanting to treat us. I mean, I got a chance to meet Michael Brain, who actually was the guy who first described MAHA. And all of this stuff, and I kind of interpret that, well, maybe North American medicine was like that, but obviously this is Canada, so it was a little different. So I wanted to see what North American medicine was like. And so I applied, and I was lucky enough that one of the students who was in my year, his father was in the faculty at Hopkins. And I had done very well in medical school. And he was telling his father about me, and his father said, tell him to apply to Barnes Hospital, but tell him not to apply as a straight intern, to apply as a rotating intern. And he had a very good chance of getting in. And if he gets in as a rotating intern, if he's any good, they'll recognize him. Probably the best piece of advice, because what I did, when I was applying, I applied to a hospital in Norwalk, Connecticut, which was affiliated with Yale. And they were offering $12,000 a year. And on the basis of what this guy's father said, I took the rotating internship at Barnes, paying me $8,000 a year. Best decision I ever made.
Yeah, you described in your article that I read recently, which was I think in Jason or C. Jason,
right,
about your obtaining your residency. Maybe you could describe that for the listeners. Meeting more.
Right. So that's actually a very interesting, because when I came to WashU, I realized that I was one, at the time, I didn't see very many, certainly in medicine, not many black faces in medicine. And this was a rotating internship where I would do 2 months on all of the specialties, including surgery, OBGYN, pediatrics, medicine. And then you had a chance to doing another 2 months in medicine or surgery if you wanted it. So I decided to do mine in medicine because I decided that I was going to be an internist and I wanted my training in internal medicine. However, I didn't know exactly how to do this. So I decided, after sort of looking at the lay of the land, to take the bull by the horns and try to make an appointment to see Carl Moore, who was then the chair of medicine. And I remember very well the day I went to make that appointment. His secretary, who I got to know pretty well subsequently, Catherine McDowell, she said to me that the earliest he could see me was in 2 weeks. So I said, fine. And as I turned to leave the office, the door opened and this distinguished gentleman in a starched white coat, slick gray hair, puffing on a pipe, opened the door. And his first question was, is there a problem? And I didn't know why he said that. because I'm sure that there were not many black physicians, at least I had my white coat on, who appeared in his office. And I said, no, there's no problem. I was just trying to make an appointment to see if I could get in to do my residency in medicine. And he looked at me for about, I would say, 20 seconds without actually saying a word. Then he said, come into my office. And I came into my office. I told him who I was, what I was doing, what I wanted, at least what I was hoping for. And he looked at me and he said, I have been 17 years as a chair of the Department of Medicine. And only 3 times had he ever appointed a rotating intern to a residency in medicine. And they were all MD PhDs. And I clearly was not a PhD. And I said, thank you very much. And I got up to leave. And then he said something very curious to me. He said, however, I want you to fill out an application. And I filled out the application, returned it, and then totally forgot about it and was making plans to return to England. And then one day I got a call from Catherine McDowell, and she said, I'd like to see you. I walked into the office and she said, Dr. Moore has authorized me to tell you that you are going to be appointed as a resident in medicine. And, but one of the interesting stories, backstories to that was, when I was rotating on OBGYN, they had in the first floor of that OBGYN building, there was a telephone operator. And every time you walked into that building, you'd have to go past the telephone operator. And usually when I go in to make rounds in the morning, I even exchange the pleasantries, good morning, and in the evening, goodbye, etc. And then she said, I walked in one morning and she said, I didn't know you were interested in medicine. This was actually before, 2 weeks before I got the call that I was going to be accepted. And I said, how does she know that? So I said, yes, and then I started thinking a little bit about it. It turns out that what Carl Moore had done was that he had reached out either by himself or through Catherine to find out that anybody I had touched, what they thought of me. And that went all the way through the chair of surgery, because I rotated to surgery, all the way down to the telephone operator. And in retrospect, that was one of the most extraordinary things, interviews I could say that I've ever thought that anybody would have.
It's an interesting story. I often think that's maybe the most useful way to do things. At Southwestern, when I was there, for promotion, they don't ask external referees to write letters. They ask the promotions committee asks the candidate to provide the names of people that he or she thinks would recommend them. And then a member of the promotions committee calls that person, interviews them, and asks for 2 more names. and they do that, this sort of interview tree to reach out, and people, of course, will say things on the phone they won't put in a letter.
Right.
And so, I've often thought that was a much more probing way to find out what people are like than reading boilerplate letters. And I recommended it to Vicky, but it didn't get much of anywhere. So I'm interested to know, your article touched on racism in medicine in the United States. And, when I was at Duke, Eugene Stead, who was the chair, and I guess shortly before I got there, he had stepped down, who was from Georgia. But as far as I could tell, his discrimination was against stupid people. And I often thought, as I got to know his son better, who was a classmate of mine, that this may have had something to do that he trained with Selma Weiss at the Boston City Hospital Thorndike Laboratory. And Moore, of course, I think was the son of an Irish cop, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
And was he open-minded from your experience?
It's very interesting. In retrospect, when I began thinking a little bit, why did Carl Moore ask me to fill out that application? And I think that there was a resident who happened to be black, who I think was the first black resident who ever got onto Barnes Hospital. He came from Harvard, and I think Carl Moore was beginning to think at the time that there were not enough blacks on the house staff, because in those days, the ward service was his hand-picked service. He picked 12, which he himself picked. And then that was the basis of the ward service from year to year. You know, people like Phil Cryer, Jeff Rosenfeld, Joe Alvarez, all of these people who went through that phase. And I got the impression in my short interaction with Moore, because he actually died late in '71, that he was really very interested in seeing how I would perform in the context of Barnes Hospital. And I think he actually advised that when just before he died, I think he spoke to Dave Kipnis about me, because it was very striking how things actually subsequently went on. So I think he was very anxious to see if he could handpick either underrepresented minorities and put them into the house staff and see how things would work out. So I may have been there at the right time, right place, the right time.
Sure, sure. Did you have to repeat, or not really repeat, did you have to do a PGY 1 year in medicine then?
That's the other thing. I told him that I'd be willing to repeat it. And when he accepted me, he said I didn't have to repeat it. I'd go straight into residency in medicine.
Well, that was nice.
Yes, it was.
I think a lot of people at the time.
I think part of the reason was I spent 4 months in medicine, and I interacted with a number of the, people like Bill Doherty, Perkoff. I think I'm not sure if Dave Alpers was there at the time. I think he came subsequently. But a number of these people who actually had interacted with me as an intern, and I think it was passed on that I was pretty good, and that's why I didn't need to repeat that year.
Now, was Richard Ock there at that point? Was he running the house staff program?
Let's see now. Yeah, Richard Ock, was he? Yes, he was the head. Yeah, he ran the house staff program then. Yes.
And what year did you become a resident? What year was that?
I became a junior resident in 1971.
Now, the people listening to this may not know that there were 2 residency services
That's correct.
At Barnes. There was the prestigious ward service and the slightly less prestigious private service, which I believe was run by Ed Reinhardt.
Ed Reinhardt, correct.
And didn't they merge around 72 or 73, something like that?
Let's see now. They merged, I think they merged in 72.
So you were a resident during the time that it merged, is that right?
Right, that's correct.
Okay. And so then you finished your residency, and you spent 2 years as a nephrology fellow, is that right?
Correct. Right.
And then came back as a chief resident.
That's right.
Now, I see you were the first Black chief resident before Williams, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
What was that like? What was that experience like?
It was an interesting experience. I think having that gap between the house staff, spending 2 years of fellowship, and then becoming chief resident gave me a little bit of I guess, credibility with the house staff. So that even though I had a lot of challenges, that is, people would challenge my decision making, but I would always get support from David when I actually did this. But it was always a challenge, and I always had to try to be as fair as possible, because I knew the repercussions could be real. But as I went through that process of that year, I found that people began more and more to accept and didn't question as much my decision-making processes along the way, which I thought was very gratifying.
I think you said that you did your postdoctoral training with Phil Needleman, is that right?
That's correct. That was after my chief residency.
Right.
And that actually was that actually turned out to be a very instrumental point in my career, because what actually happened at the time that I was finishing up my chief residency, I was struggling with what I wanted to do, and I actually felt that I hadn't the laboratory experience and skills which would make me very competitive for NIH grants, even though I had published 3 papers. And the renal division really did not offer me a full-time position in nephrology. So I was forced then to look around and see what was available in clinical medicine outside of the academic structure. So I applied at the Grant Clinic. And they actually accepted me, and they sent me a contract, and I hadn't signed the contract yet. I was thinking a little bit about it, discussing it with my family. And then and one of the Friday afternoon live around, so to speak, Dave Kipnis popped in, and he said to me, well, what are you going to do next year? And I told him, and he said, is that what you want to do? And I said, well, it was my first choice, but I don't feel I had the laboratory skills to make me competitive. And he looked around and he thought for a minute, and then he said, don't sign that contract. I will get back to you within a week. And then he reached out to Phil Needleman, who had just come back from working with John Vane as a sabbatical, and told Phil that if Phil would take me in his laboratory, he would pay my salary.
Ah.
And and then I had an opportunity to meet Phil. Phil came over to David's office, and I met him then. And Phil, in his usual very effervescent way, was telling me what he was doing in his laboratory, etc. And it sounded very interesting to me. And I said, sure, I'd be willing to have a shot at it. And probably the best decision I ever made in my life. I mean, from the point of view of my career growth, because it just took off.
I think that may be one of the greater compliments you may have received. And by that, I mean, I only had the opportunity to work with Dave for 4 years. But one of the things I came to believe about him was that he had an extraordinary ability to detect talent and to project people's careers into the future, to understand what they might be capable of. So he must have seen something in you that made him believe that.
Yeah.
Were you close to him?
I was reasonably close. I found him to be, with me, he was very open and he was very candid, because at a subsequent point in my career, when I actually had spent some time at Vanderbilt learning how to do mass spectrometry, I came back and I went to talk to him because I was coming up, at the time I was getting close to being promoted to his tenure to associate professor, and we had this chat. And as I walked into the office, the first thing he said to me is, you're going to be promoted, but tell me a little bit about your science. And I told him what I was doing and what the restrictions were, or what the impediments to a further career. And I said, we need a mass spectrometer here, because at the time, WashU, at least in the Department of Medicine, didn't have the top grade mass spectrometers which allowed me to do clinical work in mass spectrometry. And he looked at me and he said, what does one of those things cost? And I said, $186,000. He said, I'll transfer the money into your account in 2 weeks. And I was just absolutely floored, just flabbergasted that the chair of medicine is going to transfer $186,000 into an account for me to buy a mass spectrometer. That just blew my mind.
And so I guess the rest is history. That helped your career take off.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your career. What kinds of things happened subsequent to that? What did you enjoy? What were problems? A little bit about your science and so on.
Well, one of the big things when I was chief resident that bothered me a little bit was the fact that one day I was about to go home in the afternoon, and I was dressed with a sports coat, etc., and I had a briefcase. And as I said, well, let me just go through the emergency room, because as you know, the emergency room was right now where the dialysis center is. Yep. I walked through there to talk to the house staff, because medicine serviced the ER at the time. We didn't have an ER department. And as I was about to exit the door, a guard came over to me and said he needed to search my briefcase. So I gave him the briefcase, he opened it. But while I was doing this, I realized that here was I, the chief resident in medicine, exiting the building. The house staff was over there. Everybody was curious, so why are they searching my briefcase? And I realized what was going on, because this was, as I said to myself subsequently, this is probably the first and probably the last time a chief resident's briefcase is going to be searched. And the reason it was being searched was simply because I was black. Okay. So that was really my first real serious problem. It actually affected me personally. Okay. So that most of the negative aspects of my interaction tend to occur with people or with systems which were in place, which were essentially not very welcoming to blacks, like the police or or something of that nature. I didn't have many problems with my peers, and I didn't seem to have many problems either with members of the Department of Medicine. Those seemed to work reasonably well. Sort of when I went in to work with Phil was really very magnanimous. He actually pushed me into positions. I got a chance to meet, while I was working with him, I got a chance to meet 3 Nobel laureates. You know, he sent me to meetings where all of these people were there, and I got a chance. So my science started to grow very quickly. I got into the Young Turks, the American Society of Clinical Investigation, in 1983. And I didn't realize it until recently, within the last 2 years, that I was the first African American ever to get into the ASCI.
I didn't know that either.
I didn't know that. I mean, that actually, I found that out in an article that was published in the JSCI about 2 years ago. And they had the first, I think the first 5 blacks who actually got into the ASCI. And it included myself, Jim Gavin, and Griff Rogers. But all different years. So I was the first to get in. I didn't know that. And so once that happened, I was promoted, and then I was promoted to full professor in 1987. So things went very well for me here within the structure. And nationally also, I continued to get grants, and actually was the chair of the cardiorenal study section of the American Heart Association, got into study sections, and actually I did relatively well. So I was perfectly happy with the trajectory of my professional career.
It sounds like it's the kind of career arc that might have led you to be a division chief in nephrology and perhaps a chair of medicine. Were there factors that caused you to want to stay in St. Louis as opposed to pursuing those opportunities?
Well, I was married and I had children, and I didn't really want to move at the time. The other thing was that I was asked to look at two jobs in particular. One of them was the chief of nephrology in San Antonio, Texas, and the other one was at the University of Maryland. And on both of those visits, the thing that struck me was the space that was available for laboratory pursuits was nowhere near what I could get at Washington, what I personally could get, and what the total division space was. So I was spoiled. My perspectives were totally different. I suspect if someone had asked me to look at Harvard or Yale or Hopkins, it might have been a very different position. But I said, you know, you really must want to be a chief badly to leave WashU, and that was my perspective. And so I stayed at WashU, and the only opportunity I might have had at WashU was when Salo went over to be chair of medicine, and Mark Hammerman became the chief of nephrology. And David did interview me for that position, but eventually, obviously, Mark got it. But you know, we don't turn over very often. So once that happens, then you're kind of stuck, if you will.
Yeah. What was the arc of your science over the course of the years? What kinds of things did you study?
Well, I actually started out by looking, you know, it was around the time that Bengt Samuelson had just discovered the structure for thromboxane, and I, in a model of renal obstruction, while I was in Phil's lab, we showed that the kidney had the capacity to make this compound, and it affected renal vascular resistance, and that was published in Nature. And working with the model, we realized that there was something very unusual about that kidney. It began producing a tremendous amount of prostaglandins. And one of the things that was striking about it is that if that prostaglandin was produced, you could inhibit it with actinomycin D or with inhibitors of protein synthesis. And that was unusual because the cyclooxygenase, once you purify it, is really, it's pretty stable in most cells. So we had this model where you had this tremendous induction. Then we developed an antibody to try to prove it. And the antibody, which was developed against the cyclooxygenase that everyone knew about, the sheep seminal vesicle one, didn't react. It didn't show that there was any increase in cyclooxygenase. But from a pharmacological and physiological, it was clear there was an enzyme being induced. So that we actually had this dramatic induction. We knew there was an enzyme being induced, but the antibody didn't pick it up. And that was actually the first demonstration that there was a second cyclooxygenase. So that then actually I left Phil's lab then, and he continued that particular project. It turned out that that was the first demonstration, really, that there was a second cyclooxidase. And that's really where we did most of the contributions. Phil went on to clone it in his laboratory, and then they developed an antibody against a peptide which actually recognized the cyclooxidase, the second cyclooxidase. And actually, that was the reason he actually left WashU, because he didn't have the resources to develop, because he wanted to develop an inhibitor for that enzyme. Right. He didn't have the resources, but Monsanto did.
Right. Yeah, that was quite a remarkable thing, that Monsanto WashU shuttle and subsequent agreement. Yeah. Did you profit from that at all? Did you receive any Monsanto money?
I didn't. So I didn't profit financially, but the way I profited in a way was because of my relationship with Phil. I was able to do a mini sabbatical at Monsanto because I wanted to learn some molecular biology. So he put me in contact with someone who was one of their gurus in molecular biology at the time. So I spent about 6 months, but I would go like 3 days of the week to the Monsanto and 1 day a week or 2 days in my own laboratory at WashU. I took a postdoc and we did some molecular biology and started bringing some of the techniques back into the laboratory. So from that perspective, and I got to know a number of the people who were at Monsanto. Yes.
So you mentioned that by the time you were, somebody that was recruitable, you were married and had children. Did you meet your wife here, or did you meet her in Ireland, or
in St. Louis? Yes.
In St. Louis, yeah. So what has life been like in St. Louis for you?
Actually, St. Louis has grown on me. Initially, I wanted to, I grew up close to water, and I wanted to be close to water. But I think I came because of WashU, and I would say I stayed because of WashU and family issues. And so there came a point in time when I didn't have the desire to find out much about any other cities. I had sort of put down roots, and this was perfect. And to be perfectly honest, I actually became very enamored by Washington University as an institution of higher learning, and I really loved it.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. It's maybe not such a big secret anymore, but I have been struck by the degree of collaboration that occurs here as opposed to Harvard or UCSF.
Yeah.
Here people are much more likely to share and I think be good mentors and promote young people's careers as opposed to promoting their own.
Right.
So perhaps a word about clinical nephrology. What do you think is the most important thing, or one or two things that's happened in clinical nephrology over the course of your career?
I think one of the things that stands out to me is that, nephrology as a specialty has been, it was built by people who were fundamentally renal physiologists, people like Don Selden, Floyd Rector, all of these people. So renal physiology and the understanding of transport of sodium and potassium became the big building blocks for which the nephrology specialty. But as we have progressed based on sequencing of the human genome, we've come to recognize that a lot of glomerular diseases have a lot of molecular and genetic underpinnings, and I think that's an area where we're expanding very quickly. The understanding of pathogens, for example, of membranous nephropathy, the discovery of the anti-PLA2 antibody, those kinds of things, the genetics of hypertension done by, like, say, Rick Lifton, secondary hypertension, understanding the molecular defects in a number of the transporters which could affect blood pressure. Those kinds of things have been really fascinating for me. I actually tend to like that because it takes transport and puts it firmly in the clinical arena with genetic defects. And that I have a great deal of affinity for.
So in my own area, when Ed Silverman was here, before he went back when he went to Harvard, one of his dissertation project was looking at alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency in blood bank donors. And it turns out the most common phenotype for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is normal. And whereas if you looked in a pulmonary clinic, you'd think everybody had bad emphysema. And if you looked in a pediatric liver clinic, you'd think they all had, liver disease. What do you, are you interested in, or have you followed this business about the ApoL1 gene that, seems to predispose? What do you think that's going to fit? Is that going to be causative under the right circumstances or causative frequently, or what do you think that's going to fit?
I think it's causative possible under the right circumstances, because I think there are a group of people, certainly of African American ancestry, who, if they have either a compound homozygous mutation of the two alleles or a compound heterozygote, they can develop renal disease, and it usually expresses itself as focal glomerulosclerosis. But one of the important things about knowing about this mutation has to do with renal transplantation, because if you identify that you should not be taking kidneys from these patients and transplanting it into their sublinks. So it actually helps in excluding certain patients because you're going to waste kidneys that way. So it's actually kind of an important issue with transplantation.
Very interesting. So did any of your children go into medicine?
No. I have a daughter who's in law and a son who told me that I worked too hard. He didn't want to go into medicine.
So when you counsel medical students, do you tell them to go into internal medicine?
Yeah, I tend to encourage them to go into internal medicine. Sometimes I think it's hard because medical students these days, they like to see rapid results. And so I actually find that even the top medical students are going into ENT, ophthalmology, and orthopedics, and less going into internal medicine, which I think is kind of sad, but I guess that's the way it goes, you know.
Yeah, I think money might have something to do with it too.
Yes, indeed.
So if Joe Biden called you up and asked you for advice, what single piece of advice would you give him?
Well, I think mine is a little biased. You know, I grew up at a stage where it was a little bit easier to get money to do research. And I think as a nation, we are not spending enough on R&D in terms of the biomedical research as some of the other countries are. And I think it shows. I mean, you can look at the publication record in top journals in the United States. It almost used to be almost entirely from America. Now, other countries have caught up. They have spent a lot of money, but I think there are areas where bright ideas are not getting funded. And I think we do need to spend a little bit more money. The rate at which the NIH budget has gone up is not nearly as where it should be. And my sense would be he needs to spend a little bit more money. I would think that another doubling of the NIH budget is not unreasonable. I mean, you're only talking about what? Going from about $35 billion to $70 billion. I mean, you know, in the context of budgets that are $2.33 trillion, that's you know, but we spend a lot of money wasting on other things.
Yeah, and it's hard to argue that it hasn't paid off.
That's absolutely, yeah. Yeah, just look at these new mRNA viruses for COVID. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Now, I don't know anything about Guyana's healthcare system. Was there universal healthcare in Guyana?
No, there wasn't universal healthcare. I mean, you know, Guyana was kind of a little bit of a hybrid. If you didn't have any money, you could get healthcare in the public hospitals. But if you had money, you get much better healthcare if you go to the private hospitals. So again, you still see this schism between the haves and the have-nots. So that's really there.
And of course, Ireland was in the National Health Service. I think
That's
when
correct.
they were there. Is that right?
That's
Do you have any thoughts about access to healthcare in the United States?
I'll tell you, most healthcare in the United States is shifted too much towards healthcare in an emergency room. There's got to be a way to deliver healthcare to the community in a cost-effective way where people don't spend half their lives in the emergency room waiting to be taken care of. There are a lot of diseases, but unfortunately, even I know, for example, if I went out and tried to find a PCP, they're hard to find. And I'm in a protected, I mean, I know people. If you are not in the medical field and you needed a PCP, I mean, it's tough to find one if you don't have some connections. And so you're kind of forced into waiting until something happens, then you go to the hospital, you know. But the other side of the coin is, I just wonder whether or not PCPs are happy just simply taking care of patients. When they get sick, they lose care when they come into the hospital. It's something that I would have liked to take care of my patient, but I understand why the way things are. But it's a little bit of a decision, and I just wonder how many PCPs are happy.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you ask because, you know, as part of another project, I've interviewed 10 or 11 internists of various stripes. And I would say that the happiest PCPs right now are the ones that are basically fee-for-service concierge. And part of that is because they see about half as many patients per working day.
Yeah.
They have more time, they can think. You know, they don't have the return office visit, the primary purpose of which is to generate revenue, you know, as opposed to actually delivering healthcare. So it's an interesting conundrum, and I don't really want this interview to be about me, but I'm working with the ACP governor for Arizona, and we're looking to see what's happened with these assistant physicians in Missouri, because Arizona just passed a law as well, where they take these kids that can't get residency positions and they make them basically apprentice physicians out in rural communities. And there's no information about what happens to them that's publicly available as of yet. And of course, you also see these laws or attempts at laws popping up, again, largely in states with large rural areas for independent practice for nurse practitioners and PAs and so on. And I think the fundamental underlying problem is you can't attract primary care doctors to small towns in rural America anymore.
Yes.
Life is too hard, the money's too little.
Right.
You know, the access.
System, good school system. So.
Yeah, school systems, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's a difficult problem, and I think, you know, I made the point that, you know, that as we fight these individual battles, we're like the drunk looking for his keys under the spotlight because that's where the light is good. When I think the fundamental problem is support systems, better pay for primary care doctors, universal health care, and of course we're faced with a situation like in Missouri where medication expansion is being actively thwarted by the Republican legislature.
Right.
Refusal to fund it. So it's kind of a mess. Well, this has been a delightful interview. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I think other people will enjoy listening to it as well. So I want to thank you very much, Dr. Morrison.
Welcome. Very well.